Of all executioners, none were more shunned than the bourreaux of France. They were an enigma, men who performed their duties on a public stage, but strove for anonymity. Few people encountered them, and most that did never lived to tell the tale. But why were French executioners so much more feared than their other Western counterparts? The executioner was inextricably linked to the two most potent symbols of power, the monarchy and the church. For the Catholic Church, absolution of sin was central to its creed. As the man who dispensed high justice, the executioner became a sacred figure.
First of all, because he has the right to administer death, and at the same time he's well aware that killing a person who's no longer dangerous because he's a prisoner is a sin. So he takes on the sin for everyone else. It is he who assumes the moral responsibility before God.
Executioners had to receive a certificate of Catholicism from the Church. Without it, they were forbidden to perform their duties. And, in equal measure, they were linked to the man who was perceived as God's agent on earth, the monarch. It was the king's right to dispense high justice, the right of divine grace.
The king sits on his throne in the light, but in order to be completely sovereign, he needs to have in his shadow a second person who is the king of shadows, and that is the executioner. The executioner and the sovereign represent the absolute duo, God and the devil.
This king of shadows was deemed to possess almost supernatural qualities. On the one hand, holy, on the other, unclean. And with the power of the throne behind him, the executioner was seemingly untouchable. The revulsion he aroused was matched by a dread fascination. As a last resort, people would turn to him for miraculous remedies. Incredibly, it can be argued that some of the earliest French doctors were in fact executioners, dispensing unctions made of human bone and body fat in the dead of night. For centuries, this was the lot of the executioner, and so it might have remained until fate linked his fortunes to a remarkable yet deadly machine. The history of French executioners is rich in symbolism, its language shrouded in euphemisms. The most powerful symbol of their profession had many names. The national razor, the people's avenger. The authorities prefer to call it the timbers of justice. And though history has remembered it as the guillotine, even now the French know it by another name.
In France, the guillotine is not called the guillotine. People call it the widow, because it severs, it separates. It is the knife, and the executioner is called the executioner, not the executor of high works as his title used to be. It is the widow because he makes widows.
There is no mistaking its function. Where a rope can be used to tie things other than necks, and even a sword to cut things other than flesh, the widow has only one purpose: to kill. And yet, arguably, it was born of noble purpose. By the late 18th century, the commoners of France were taxed to the hilt, living in squalor and near starvation. In 1789, they finally unleashed their wrath against the seeming indifference of the monarchy, church, and nobility. What was seen as one of the great injustices of the time was the way punishment was dispensed. Commoners were broken on the wheel, burnt, or strangled on the rope. But noblemen were offered what was considered to be a more honourable death, beheading by the sword.
So why was it reserved for the nobility? Because since their early childhood, noblemen had been brought up with the idea that they might have to pay for the privileges they had with their lives by being killed on the battlefield for the king. So they were taught to have what was called firmness of arms, fortitude.
It called for a lot of cooperation with the victim because the victim had to stand or kneel, on rare occasions sit in a chair, and it was an unspoken cooperation that was necessary, indeed vital, because if the victim flinched or shook or shuddered or at worst fainted, then the sword's accuracy would go awry.
In fact, many beheadings were botched and bloody affairs. More often than not, the executioner had to finally sever the head with a dagger. This deference did not sit well with revolutionary ideals. If all men were equal in life, why not in death? This question was put to the National Assembly by Dr. Joseph Guillotine, professor of anatomy at the Paris Faculty of Medicine. The doctor argued that all condemned to die should, in effect, be raised to the status of nobility and be beheaded. On the grounds of humanity, Guillotine suggested a decapitation machine would be more certain, swift and merciful. Death, he boasted, would be painless and over in the twinkling of an eye. And though he was initially mocked, the notion of democratizing death won favor, and the machine was designed and built. 4.5 meters high, 2 upright beams housed a heavily weighted blade. Its most novel feature was a simple device to immobilize the victim's head, the lunette, so called because the crescent-shaped cutouts looked like a little moon. Fortitude would not be required for a victim of this device. It was unveiled with a fanfare of publicity on April the 25th, 1792. Its first victim, Nicolas Pelletier, was not a murderer, but a humble thief. It certainly lived up to Guillotine's promise. Pelletier was gone in the twinkle of an eye. The crowd hated it.
They were extremely disappointed because they were used to seeing the hanged man jiggling on the end of his rope, and now it was all over in a matter of seconds. A little song was invented, "Give us back our wooden gallows, give us back the wooden gallows," because this very swift decapitation was no longer an amusing spectacle.
But its devastating speed and efficiency would lead to bloodshed on a scale previously unimagined. Revolutionary zealots embarked on a purge of the aristocracy. Daily executions could number in the hundreds. And yet, despite this carnage, the machine became the novelty of the age.
The French took the guillotine to their hearts. Literally, women wore tiny miniature guillotine-shaped earrings. Wooden models were given to the children to play with. Models of the guillotine were placed on the dinner table so the gentlemen could trim the ends of their cigars with it.
Its cultural impact was enormous and long-lasting. It spawned songs, theatre, and even erotica. When cinema came, the obsession with decapitated heads remained. And beneath the dark humour lay a genuine unease about the use of the guillotine, one that was to last well into the 20th century. Decapitation was so swift, how could anyone be sure that death was instantaneous?
A lot of things have been said about the possibility of the survival of thought in the head of a guillotined person.
It was observed that the eyes and the lips went on moving, and this fascinated French scientists who carried out a certain number of experiments. They surmised that a falling blade, whether it be by sword or the guillotine blade, severed everything so rapidly that the brain was still being fed by what blood was there. And if the brain was alive, consciousness could continue for X number of seconds. Therefore, it follows rationally that the head falling from the guillotine would see the basket coming up to meet him or her or it, and would still be able to see the jeering faces on the crowds as the head was held high.
As late as 1905, a Dr. Boria reported, "I waited for several seconds. The face relaxed, the lids half closed on the eyeballs, leaving only the white of the conjunctiva visible. It was then that I called in a strong, sharp voice, 'Langui!'
And he took careful note that the eyes slowly opened and focused on him, and then glazed, and the eyes closed again."
The doctor was convinced that living eyes returned his gaze. Others weren't so sure.
Obviously, that is a question one cannot answer. At the moment of the sudden and simultaneous rupture of the spine and the carotid arteries, blood shoots out very violently from the trunk and the head, as well as part of the liquid surrounding the brain and spinal cord. Under such conditions, it's hard to see how the brain could continue to function, deprived of blood and deprived of some of its nervous system.
Whatever the truth, the machine cast its shadow over France for 2 centuries. The question is, what effect did this engine of death have on its operators? Buried here amongst the great and the good of Parisian society is the executioner who put more people to death than any other in recorded history. Charles-Henri Sanson. But for a man who is called the keystone of the revolution, he remains an elusive, shadowy figure. Not a single accurate portrait of him exists. A dubious biography authored by his grandson paints a picture of a sensitive man, revolted by his work and racked with guilt, and a man whose supposed royalist sympathies put him in mortal danger. The truth is somewhat murkier. Charles-Henri Sanson was the 4th generation of his family to become executioner. He was just 15 when the king signed his letters of office. Some of his forebears had been even younger.
They have an absolutely identical path to that of the king. Louis XIV became king at the age of 5, and we have children of executioners who benefited from letters of office when they were only a few months old. And if the father dies, and they are too young to take over, a relative, who is an executioner in another town, will become his regent.
But even a baby would have to be present at the scaffold to solemnize the proceedings. The sons of executioners were truly baptized in blood and faced a grisly future. Remarkably, the family had to pay for the letters of office, but it was worth it. Since no one would sell goods to the executioner, the king granted droit de havage, the right to dip into. The executioner was allowed to take a fixed percentage of goods. And in a city as rich as Paris, the pickings were good.
He would try to bequeath the post to his children, or son-in-law, brother, or other relatives, who, as far as other people are concerned, are already branded with infamy. Consequently, if one is infamous, at least be infamous and rich.
When the revolution came, it was a very different story. Initially, Sanson may have welcomed it. The revolution promised to deliver the respectability he craved. For the first time, the two great outcasts of society, actors and executioners, were granted citizenship and the right to vote. Sanson had already successfully petitioned the king to outlaw the defamatory expression, bourreau. But the executioner's links to the monarchy and the old order were a double-edged sword. When a pro-aristocracy press was discovered in his house, Sanson faced the prospect of meeting an executioner himself. Under interrogation, he claimed he simply rented the room and had no idea what it was used for. In the event, the executioner went free, but knew his position was a precarious one. When the National Assembly debated Guillotine's proposals to inflict all death sentences by decapitation, they consulted their executioner.
When the council said that all criminals should be executed by the sword, Charles Henri turned around and said, well, this would be practically impossible because the sword is a finely honed weapon and it is blunted after the first one or two executions, and there aren't enough swords to cope with the thousands that you're expecting me to exterminate.
In truth, Sanson feared a bloody mess, and when the guillotine was adopted, no one could have been happier than the executioner.
One of the illusions of the assembly that adopted decapitation as the ultimate penalty is that the executioner would no longer be an outcast because he was no longer doing the actual killing. It was the machine.
Instead, Sanson became a victim of the machine's success and excess. The years 1792 to 1794 saw a murderous campaign to rid France of the aristocracy and anyone else considered a traitor to the revolutionary cause. It was the Reign of Terror, and Sanson's daily routine became a nightmare. Each morning, prisoners were collected from the dreaded conciergerie. Men, women and children were loaded dozens at a time in the executioner's carts, or tumbrils. The grim procession would make its way through jeering crowds to the guillotine. One by one, the condemned were marched up the scaffold steps and dispatched with lightning speed. Sometimes as many as 100 in a day.
And the three worst sounds which resounded, resonated, reverberated throughout Paris at that time were the crash as the bascule fell into a horizontal position, the metallic clang as the luneck dropped into place, and then the reverberating thud as the blade came down and the whole scaffold shook. And of course the blood ran down all over the scaffold and dripped between the boards, and at night the dogs came out and licked it up and the smell was appalling, and the local residents supplied to have it moved to different areas.
In a bitter irony, this bloodletting led to a devastating personal tragedy for Sanson.
Any execution was always aided by his sons, and on one occasion Charles Henri's son raised a head high, because it was essential in those days to convince the crowd that the person condemned to death had in fact been executed and it wasn't a stand-in or somebody else. And the son did just that, but then lost his footing on the heavily blood-soaked scaffold boards and slipped off the side of the scaffold and broke his neck and died. And it was a tragedy over which Charles Henri never recovered.
Sanson, already in his 50s, was physically and mentally exhausted. And he wasn't indifferent to the wholesale slaughter he'd embarked upon. Like most executioners of his day, he was not without culture or education.
What's very strange is that since the end of the 18th century, most executioners adored music. They loved to go to concerts, and some of them played an instrument. They could all read and write, which wasn't common at the time. And this was all the more curious as they weren't admitted to schools. Tutors were brought in at great expense and in great secrecy, who came to give them a few lessons at home, hiding themselves, of course, otherwise they wouldn't have had any other pupils.
Because he was basically an intelligent and highly educated man, he was full of horror. He was faced with having to exterminate hundreds of people who, in his book, to a great extent, had committed no crime except being highborn.
But the few letters he left behind were mostly complaints to the authorities about money. Havage had been replaced with a modest salary, and the executioner was no longer allowed to keep and sell the personal effects of the condemned. And the guillotine brought its own problems. Sanson needed at least 7 assistants to cope with the vast numbers sent his way. He paid and lodged them himself. He hired the carts, the carpenters to erect the scaffold, and had to buy endless supplies of bran to soak up the residue of the Red Theatre. But his complaints fell on deaf ears.
He had no alternative but to continue the appalling production line or extermination line of death on the scaffold, because he knew very well that if he had backed down, probably he himself would have been executed.
The acid test of his alleged royalist tendencies came on the 21st of January 1793, when he was called upon to execute the very man who empowered him, King Louis XVI. In an act that was to shock the whole of Europe, Sanson went ahead, and also later took the life of Queen Marie Antoinette. It's rumoured that the executioner was heartbroken, and afterwards said Mass for his fallen sovereign. And though there's nothing to prove this, Sanson was so stung by accusations that he'd sold morbid relics of the execution, including locks of the king's hair, he issued a statement to the press. If any of it has been sold, the infamous trade can only have been carried on by knaves. The truth is that I did not allow anyone connected with me to take away or appropriate the smallest vestige of it. Sanson may well have been telling the truth on this occasion, but the executioner had almost certainly profited from an equally gruesome sideline. Supplying the heads of his most notorious victims to the young waxworks modeler, Marie Grossholz. Effigies were fashioned overnight and on display the very day after the execution. Grossholz's Chamber of Horrors would become internationally famous by her married name, Madame Two-Sword. The terror came to an end with the execution of the revolutionary zealot, Maximilien Robespierre. Sanson, suffering from kidney disease, relinquished the post to his eldest son, Henri. He died in 1804, and would perhaps be mortified to see himself memorialized by the word he hated, bourreau. By the turn of the 19th century, death had been reduced to the mundane, and far from saving the reputation of the executioner, the guillotine and the terror had only sullied it further. All the revolution had changed was his master. He no longer served the king, he served the guillotine, and simply followed orders. Any orders. And ironically, for a society that had so rejected the privileges of royalty, the executioners would perpetuate their own form of dark monarchy, passing the title to each new generation. And the late 19th century saw the rise of a dynasty that was to dominate the guillotine until its very end. The most momentous change for the bourreau came in 1871, and it was most unwelcome. In a single savage stroke of the pen, the executioners of France were abolished. All bar one. He would be the national executioner of all France, and known by yet another euphemism, Monsieur de Paris, the man from Paris. The chief executioner and the guillotine would be dispatched by train to wherever required. The executioners who had lost their living faced a bleak future. No one would employ the bourreau. Most survived on a meagre pension, and all coveted the position of Monsieur de Paris. The first was Jean Heinrich, descendant of an ancient bourreau family from Alsace.
And this same Mr. Heinrich, who decapitated people without appearing to have a problem, was nevertheless very worried by what he did, because he would go home, take a bath, go to bed, and he would fast for a day, and had a mass said for the soul of the person he'd executed that morning.
Heinrich had no children or family to follow him. On his death, the post passed to a family whose very name became synonymous with executioner, the de Blairs. Since executioners were no longer commonplace, the de Blairs found themselves the object of intense media scrutiny. And none more so than Anatole, the man who would become the most famous executioner in the world. The only survivor of 4 children, he inherited the job from his father in 1899. But like many sons of executioners before him, it was not a job he'd wanted. To escape it, he joined the army. But the spectre of his father's profession followed. Shunned and taunted, Anatole quit and resigned himself to the inevitable. He soon paid the price when a carpenter refused to let his daughter marry the executioner. No one wanted the disgrace of marrying into a bourreau family. De Blair was lucky to meet Rosalie Rogy. She was bourreau.
The members of their families could only intermarry with members of other executioners' families. It was a closed clan.
This led to the creation of actual dynasties. They'd all married women who were already used to it. Since they had been born into the profession, they were perfectly accustomed to the hostility of the public.
Executioners were even exempt from the law forbidding marriage between first cousins. All executioners since the 11th century were ultimately descended from just 62 families. The names of Desfourneaux, Desmoret, Berger and Ferret had strode the scaffold for centuries and were still assisting at executions well into the 20th. Rosalie was a proud and strong woman. She needed to be to rise above the daily petty insults, where even the baker would hand her a loaf upside down to mark her as different. But there were compensations. In the late 19th century, the role of Monsieur de Paris was an extremely lucrative one. The annual retainer was equivalent to that of an army general's salary. The de Blairs lived well, and with the spoils of his profession, de Blair enjoyed the trappings of a bourgeois life. He adored cars, cinema, theatre, and enjoyed nothing more than an aperitif at sidewalk cafes. The press were fascinated by this man, but he was wary of them. His father Louis had been treated with scorn. A slight man, critics have dubbed him le boiteur, the limper. He was considered slow and clumsy, a man not fit to be the finisher of the law. His son received a much more enthusiastic welcome.
Something that the critics of the period noted was that he had a certain air of elegance about him.
At his Paris debut, one reporter wrote, "All the newspapers agree in congratulating young de Blair for his remarkable flick of the wrist and his old-timer's ease. Young, elegantly dressed, like a duel witness, he performs to perfection the role of bourreau moderne. We can, after this first showing, predict a long and prosperous career." De Blair may have been reluctant to follow the calling, but he was a consummate professional, which was just as well. The French authorities distanced themselves from him and his work as much as the public did. They wouldn't even take responsibility for the guillotine. It was the executioner's property. De Blair kept his family heirloom in a suburban lockup and spent many hours tending, maintaining, and perfecting it. When its services were required, the guillotine was transported in the fourgon, a sinister-looking wagon that also contained basic accommodation, in case hotels refused to put up the executioners. Constantly fearful of sabotage, de Blair watched every step. The guillotine and the executioner were always targets for political malcontents. De Blair's father had narrowly escaped a kidnap attempt when called to execute anarchists in the 1870s. And de Blair never booked passage or travelled under his own name. He was always Monsieur Boyer, his grandmother's maiden name. By the 20th century, executions took place in front of prisons. Executions always took place at sunrise. And it was a quirk of French law that the last man to know the execution was imminent was the condemned man himself. Before he was reprieved, Jacques Le Rouge spent 92 days on death row.
You start to live at night and sleep during the day. Because the hour of the executioner is 5 o'clock in the morning. That means at 5:15 you have another 24 hours reprieve so you can sleep. And your biological clock will become synchronized to 5 in the morning.
Le moment où effectivement, lorsque vous entendez des bruits, 5 heures du matin, 5h15...
The moment when you hear the sounds at 5 in the morning in the cell block, it's a bad sign. Because there ought not to be any sound. To such an extent that the prison officers who patrol the condemned cell block wear slippers. Between the moment when the door is opened and you go to the guillotine, it's no more than 15 minutes. Imagine what that is. 1/4 of an hour.
When Philippe Lemaire escorted his client on the last walk, even he was surprised at the final anachronism of a French execution.
Then something happened which I hadn't expected. He was asked to sign a register. And then I got annoyed and asked, "Why do you want him to sign a register?" This is where the absurdity comes in, because in order to be executed, you must be released. You can't execute someone who's in custody. Only free men are executed. So you go to the prison administration, where you're released from your bonds and are handed over as a free man to the executioner.
To ensure nothing could impede the blade, the executioner performed the ritualistic toilette du condamné, the toilet of the condemned.
Then you have the whole procedure of the executioner's assistants, who cut the collar of your shirt, who cut your hair, etc., who prepare you like a parcel. His hands were tied behind his back. His feet were tied. And it was a sort of packet that was brought to the guillotine. It no longer had anything of a man.
The last few moments required nerves and speed, and the most crucial role was not that of executioner, but his assistant first class, the photograph.
That terrible person who seizes the condemned by the hair or the ears to adjust the head in the hole. The blade falls only a centimetre from his fingers. Consequently, he knows better than anyone the imperatives of the profession. If he was a bit slow, the blade fell too quickly and he had a finger cut off.
Or bitten off. But failure to bear the neck correctly also carried the gruesome risk of partial decapitation.
And it is the executioner who pulls on the chain so the knife falls.
Whilst the equipment was cleaned of blood, de Blair attended the burial of his victim. And then, as though nothing had happened, the bourreau would take in the sights, buying souvenirs like any other tourists. As an executioner, de Blair was only as good as his team. But many assistants had been experienced executioners in their own right. They all wanted the chief's job. Professional jealousy was rife and trust didn't come easily. Anatole chose his team carefully and from close to home. He had another good reason. The executioner's only son died as an infant. Succession of the title would pass to a member of his team. Big Louis Roger was his brother-in-law. Henri de Fourneau married Big Louis's daughter. The de Fourneaus had been executioners since the 14th century. André Obrecht was the son of Madame de Blair's sister, who had died giving birth to him. Anatole treated his nephew as a son. The team was the family, and the family was the team. They might have been the mafia. They did everything together. An executioner only spent time with other executioners. But even amongst this extraordinary clan of killers, one subject was taboo, the very thing that bound them together.
De Blair did not permit talking shop among the family. He had a good sense of humour and loved to joke, but no jokes could be made about the guillotine. He was the only one who might permit himself to make a joke about it from time to time. And once, when he took a photograph, he didn't frame the shot properly, and the heads of some of the people in the photo had been cut off. When he saw this, he said, "Ha! It was inevitable. It's a de Blair photo." But he was the only one allowed to make a joke about it.
But in 1906, the Bureau found themselves out of work. The new president, Armand Fallières, was passionately opposed to capital punishment and systematically reprieved all condemned prisoners. The public were outraged and took to the streets. "Vive de Blair," they chanted. "Vive la guillotine." The reviled Bureau was now the people's champion. De Blair fanned the fire, telling reporters that violent crime was on the increase. It did him no good. For 3 years, there were no executions in France. His salary cut, the Bureau managed to find some work as a champagne salesman under the name of Monsieur Roger. In 1909, bowing to public and political pressure, the president relented. De Blair was summoned to conduct the most sensational execution of his career. The first quadruple execution since 1870. From across Europe, more than 100,000 people flocked to Béthune. The condemned were the Paulet gang, ruthless criminals whose campaign of robbery and murder terrorized the Pas-de-Calais region for 3 years. If the Bureau were rusty, it didn't show. All 4 men were dead in less than 9 minutes. When de Blair spoke, it was only to say, "Next." Although photographs of public executions were strictly forbidden, this remarkable sequence spawned a healthy trade in illicit postcards. De Blair was the man of the moment. Newspapers devoted entire editions to him. Criminals sported macabre tattoos, "Promise to de Blair," "My head to de Blair." In South America, his name appeared in the dictionary as a noun for executioner. He became an ambassador for the guillotine, demonstrating it to interested foreign dignitaries. During the First World War, his services were even loaned to Belgium, where his badly shaken team conducted an execution during a Zeppelin air raid. It became easier to gain secondary employment. Big Louis, who piloted a pleasure boat on the Seine, boasted, "Before the war, we had to cover up our identities in order to get a spare time situation. These days, my name is in the telephone directory." But Big Louis was a drunken brawler who made enemies easily. He was eventually found battered to death. No one was charged with his murder. De Blair never courted publicity. He remained a lonely figure. Anatole never wrote his memoirs, but in a letter to a solicitor, he gave a pragmatic view of the executioner. "I am the executioner, a cog in the social machine. As long as the death sentence exists, the judges will be required to give the verdict and the executioner to apply this verdict. Who is responsible? The executioner or the judge?" On the 2nd of February 1939, 40 years since he'd performed his first execution as chief, de Blair prepared to conduct his 300th. It was scheduled for the next day in his own birthplace of Rennes. But at the metro station, he suffered a massive heart attack. He died in hospital a few hours later, surrounded by his team. And no one knew it, but the executioner was about to return to the shadows. On June the 17th, 1939, Eugene Wiedemann was executed outside the prison at Versailles. The new executioner, with the support of Madame de Blair, was Anatole's longtime friend Henri de Fourneau. But it was his first and last experience on the public stage. The sight of women rushing forward to dip their handkerchiefs in Wiedemann's blood was too much for the authorities. Public executions were abolished a week later. Throughout the Second World War, de Fourneau would sully the reputation of the executioner like none before him, especially in the eyes of his nephew, André Brecht. The Vichy government was collaborating with the Nazis and ordering the execution of communists and resistance fighters. De Fourneau knew this, but ploughed on regardless. Orders are orders, he shrugged. His team were appalled, especially when they had to execute women, something unheard of in the 20th century. Brecht in particular was disgusted, and the disgruntled team began their own silent protest.
His assistants sometimes tried to set traps for him. For example, when he gave an incorrect order for assembling the machine, they would carry it out without warning him that he'd made a mistake. The relationship between de Fourneau and his assistants was not good. When he went to the provinces with his assistants to perform an execution, he hardly ever saw them. He was always alone. He wouldn't go and eat with them, and he only met them at the execution, and for that reason he was completely isolated.
Finally, using a demand for higher wages as a pretext, the team resigned and Brecht took on other work.
He was a cashier at the Courbevoie dog track, and he had another job. He made iced lollies, those little ice creams they sell in the cinema. The young girls who sucked on these lollies during the interval certainly had no idea they'd been made by the hands of an executioner.
De Fourneau had become a lonely and bitter man, and he was drinking heavily.
He had a great misfortune. He had a son who committed suicide. And he was the de Fourneau's only child, so Monsieur de Fourneau became extremely withdrawn.
In 1945, he greeted the liberation with complete indifference, but the authorities didn't. Questions were asked about his conduct.
The Ministry of Justice ordered a discreet investigation to find out whether the executioners had engaged in any political activity during the war, whether they had belonged to a collaborationist group. But they hadn't been involved with this at all, and consequently no one asked to settle accounts with him.
But the executioner was a broken man. In the last months of his life, de Fourneau rarely left his bed. In 1951, he died there of a heart attack. And despite 400 applications for the post, the position went to its only true heir, André Brecht. Brecht lived his life anonymously and worked in secret. He was married twice, both times to women from outside Bureau families. But the job was now poorly paid, and executions so infrequent that it was little more than a title. Today, the bourreaux are forgotten. Even when they plied their deadly trade, they were little more than phantoms. Exempt from taxes, exempt from military service, exempt from the law which forbade marriage between cousins. They were exempt from life. Untouchable, but perhaps not untouched. Through an accident of birth, they became prisoners of a deadly calling. And were it not for the trail of headless bodies they left behind, it might be that they had never even existed.